Have you ever wondered why, despite spending a fortune on expensive chemical sprays and professional exterminators, those persistent pests like fleas, bedbugs, and roaches always seem to come back? You spray today, you see a few dead bodies on the floor, you feel a small sense of victory, and then 2 weeks later, you are right back where you started. Lifting up the couch cushions with a flashlight, wondering if you imagined the whole thing being solved in the first place. If this cycle sounds painfully familiar, you are not alone. And more importantly, you are not failing because you are doing something wrong. You are failing because the products being sold to you were never actually designed to finish the job in one go. Today, I am pulling back the curtain on a powerful, almost forgotten food-grade powder that the multi-billion-dollar pest control industry does not want sitting at the center of your conversation. Because once you understand it properly, you stop needing them nearly as much. We are talking about Food-Grade Diatomaceous Earth, and by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why this strange, chalky, slightly unglamorous powder has quietly outperformed entire shelves of branded insecticides for people who actually learn to use it the right way. Let's start with what this substance actually is, because the name alone sounds like something out of a chemistry lab, and that intimidates people away from trying it. Diatomaceous earth is not a manufactured chemical at all. It is a completely natural sedimentary substance that forms from the fossilized remains of diatoms, which are microscopic, single-celled aquatic algae that lived in oceans, rivers, and lakes millions of years ago. These tiny organisms built their cell walls out of silica, the same basic mineral found in sand and quartz. And over unimaginable stretches of geological time, their skeletal remains settled at the bottom of bodies of water and compressed into soft, chalky deposits. Mining companies dig up these ancient deposits, dry them, and grind them into the fine white or off-white powder that you can now buy in a bag for the price of a fast food meal. When you hold this powder in your hand, it feels exactly like flour or baby powder, soft, light, almost silky between your fingers. There is nothing about the texture that suggests danger or aggression. And that softness is precisely what makes the mechanism so fascinating, because what feels gentle to us at a human scale is devastating at an insect scale. Here is where the real magic happens, and where most people's understanding of pest control gets flipped upside down. Every commercial chemical insecticide you have ever bought works through a chemical attack. It poisons the insect's nervous system, disrupts its biological signaling, and essentially overdoses it to death. The problem with chemical attacks is the same problem we see with antibiotics and bacteria. Living organisms evolve. Insects reproduce extremely fast, sometimes producing new generations every few weeks, which means that any population exposed to a chemical repeatedly will eventually produce survivors who carry a genetic resistance to that exact chemical. This is documented, well-studied, and is a major reason why pest control companies have had to rotate and reformulate their chemical arsenals over the decades, constantly chasing resistant populations that have adapted to whatever was sprayed on them last season. Diatomaceous earth sidesteps this entire evolutionary arms race because it does not work chemically at all. It works mechanically and physically, the exact same way every single time, against every single generation, with zero possibility of biological adaptation. Under a regular microscope, diatomaceous earth particles look like nothing special, just irregular white grains. But under an electron microscope, magnified to a scale our eyes could never naturally perceive, those particles reveal themselves to be intricate, almost crystalline structures covered in microscopic spikes, ridges, and razor-sharp edges, like miniature shards of broken glass arranged into elaborate, geometric shells. To us, this powder is soft. To an insect crawling across it, every single grain is an abrasive blade. Insects like fleas, bedbugs, roaches, ants, and many other crawling pests have an exoskeleton, which is essentially their entire outer body armor, made of a waxy, water-resistant layer that locks moisture inside their bodies and protects them from drying out. This waxy cuticle is the only thing standing between the insect and dehydration, because, unlike humans, insects do not have an internal system for regulating water loss the way we do through skin and sweat glands. When a flea, roach, or bedbug crawls across a fine layer of diatomaceous earth, those microscopic razor-sharp particles physically scratch, pierce, and abrade this waxy protective coating as the insect moves. Each individual scratch is invisible to the naked eye. But multiply that across the dozens or hundreds of tiny cuts an insect picks up just from walking a short distance, and you start to understand the cumulative damage. Once that waxy barrier is compromised, the insect's body essentially springs a leak. Moisture begins evaporating out of its body far faster than it can be replaced, and within a relatively short period of time. Anywhere from a few hours to a couple of days, depending on the insect, environmental humidity, and amount of exposure, the insect dies purely from dehydration. There is no poison involved, there is no nerve agent, there is no chemical absorption through the skin. It is a slow, mechanical, physical process, almost like leaving a piece of fruit out in dry air until it shrivels up. Except this is happening to a living creature that desperately needs that moisture to survive even another day. This is exactly why the marketing language around diatomaceous earth often calls it a desiccant, which simply means a drying agent. It does not attack the insect's biology in the traditional sense. It attacks the insect's basic physical survival requirement, which is moisture retention. And because every insect, regardless of species, regardless of how many generations have passed, regardless of whatever genetic mutations might pop up in a population, still relies on that same waxy exoskeleton to survive, there is no version of natural selection that can produce an insect immune to having its protective layer physically scratched apart. You cannot evolve your way out of a mechanical injury the way you can evolve your way out of a chemical sensitivity. This is the core reason diatomaceous earth has remained effective for decades upon decades of continuous use, while chemical sprays keep needing to be reformulated, rebranded, and resold to consumers who are told the new bottle is somehow finally going to be the one that works. So if this substance is this effective and this cheap, why isn't it the first thing every exterminator recommends? Why isn't it on every pest control truck driving down your street? And why does the multi-billion-dollar pest control industry not push this front and center in their advertising? The honest answer comes down to basic business economics, and it is not some elaborate conspiracy. It is simply how incentive structures work. A bag of food-grade diatomaceous earth, large enough to treat an entire home multiple times over, often costs somewhere in the range of $15 to $25 depending on where you buy it. And that single bag, if stored properly in a dry place, can genuinely last you for years because you are only using small amounts at a time. Compare that to the business model of a professional pest control company, which depends almost entirely on recurring revenue. Monthly service contracts, quarterly treatments, annual renewal fees, follow-up visits when the problem inevitably resurfaces. All of this is built around the customer needing to call them back again and again. A product that genuinely solves the problem with one application that lasts indefinitely, as long as it stays dry and undisturbed, does not fit naturally into a subscription-based revenue model. It is the exact same dynamic you see in a lot of other industries, where the cheapest, most durable, most permanent solution gets quietly buried under marketing for products that require constant repurchasing. This is not about pest control companies being evil or dishonest. It is simply that their business survives on repeat visits. And a $15 bag of dust that lasts 2 years does not generate the kind of revenue that a monthly spray contract does. Now let's talk about why diatomaceous earth is considered so much safer for households with children, pets, and people with chemical sensitivities, because this is genuinely one of its strongest selling points. Food-grade diatomaceous earth is, as the name suggests, classified as safe for ingestion in small amounts, which is why it is actually used in the agricultural and food storage industry as a natural way to protect stored grains from insect infestation without contaminating the food supply with synthetic pesticide residue. It is also approved by regulatory bodies for use as an anti-caking agent in certain food and supplement products. This does not mean you should be eating spoonfuls of it as a health supplement, and there are mixed opinions on internal use that I am not going to wade into here, but from a pest control safety standpoint, this is an enormous difference compared to synthetic insecticides. Chemical sprays typically carry warnings about ventilation, contact with skin, and keeping children and pets away from treated surfaces for extended periods after application. Diatomaceous earth, used properly in food-grade form, does not carry that same level of toxicity risk. The one health consideration worth being genuinely careful about is inhalation. Because the particles are so fine and lightweight, kicking up a visible cloud of dust while applying it can irritate your lungs and airways if you breathe it indirectly, the same way flour dust or any fine powder can cause respiratory irritation. This is not because the powder is toxic to breathe in the way a pesticide fume would be. It is simply a physical irritant similar to any airborne fine particulate. The solution is straightforward, which is to apply it carefully using proper technique, wear a simple dust mask if you are sensitive to airborne particles, and avoid creating unnecessary dust clouds during application, all of which we are going to cover in detail in a moment. Let's talk about which pests this actually works against, because diatomaceous earth is not a magic bullet against literally everything that crawls, but it is remarkably effective against a wide range of common household invaders. Fleas are one of the most popular use cases, particularly for pet owners dealing with infestations in carpets, rugs, and pet bedding. Because flea larvae and adult fleas both have that same vulnerable waxy exoskeleton, diatomaceous earth applied to carpets and left to sit before vacuuming can dramatically reduce flea populations over a treatment cycle, often working in conjunction with regular vacuuming to physically remove dead insects and eggs. Bedbugs are another major target. And this is honestly one of the more impressive use cases because bedbugs have become notoriously resistant to a huge number of chemical treatments over the past 2 decades, to the point where some chemical sprays barely work on certain bedbug populations anymore, because diatomaceous earth kills mechanically rather than chemically. Bedbugs cannot develop resistance to it the way they have to pyrethroid-based sprays, which is part of why pest professionals who do still recommend it often point to bedbugs as one of the strongest applications. Roaches, particularly German cockroaches and American cockroaches, are also vulnerable, especially when the powder is placed in cracks, crevices behind appliances, and along baseboards where roaches travel in the dark. Ants can be affected as well, though ants are slightly trickier because some ant species can detect and avoid dust barriers, so placement and patience matter more with ant treatments. Silverfish, earwigs, and even certain types of mites can also be controlled using the same basic principle. What diatomaceous earth is generally not great at is dealing with flying insects in open air, since the powder only works on contact, and flying pests are not crawling across treated surfaces the way ground-dwelling and crevice-dwelling insects are. Now let's get into the actual technique, because this is where most people get it wrong and end up disappointed with results that should have worked beautifully. The single biggest mistake people make is application volume and visibility. They picture pest control the way they picture spraying a chemical, where more product means more killing power. So they dump big visible white piles of diatomaceous earth in corners, along walls, and across floors, thinking they are being thorough. This is actually counterproductive for 2 reasons. First, insects are surprisingly good at detecting and avoiding large, obvious piles of unfamiliar substance, especially roaches, which are cautious creatures that will reroute their travel paths around anything that looks unusual rather than walking straight through it. Second, a thick pile does not actually increase the kill rate, because the insect only needs to walk across a thin layer of particles to pick up enough abrasive damage to its exoskeleton. A massive pile is wasteful, looks unsightly, creates more airborne dust when disturbed, and is more likely to be avoided entirely. The correct technique is to apply what professionals call a light, almost invisible dusting. Similar to a fine layer of confectioner's sugar lightly sifted over a cake. You want the powder so thin that you can still see the surface underneath it, just lightly coated. The best tool for this is a bulb duster, which is a small handheld device with a soft rubber bulb attached to a narrow nozzle, designed specifically for puffing out controlled, even amounts of fine powder into tight spaces. You can find these inexpensively wherever gardening or pest control supplies are sold, and honestly, this single tool makes the entire process dramatically more effective compared to just shaking powder out of the bag by hand, which tends to create those clumpy, uneven piles that insects learn to avoid. Squeeze the bulb gently while aiming the nozzle into the specific target zones, and you will see a light dusty mist settle evenly across the surface, which is exactly the coverage you are aiming for. As for where to actually apply it, the goal is to target high-traffic insect pathways, rather than open floor space. Under and behind major appliances like refrigerators, stoves, washing machines, and dishwashers is one of the most important zones, because these areas stay dark, warm, and undisturbed, making them prime real estate for roaches and other pests to travel and hide. Floor cracks, gaps where baseboards meet flooring, and any visible crevices in walls or cabinetry are essentially insect highways, and a light dusting along these seams creates an invisible barrier that pests have to cross to move through your home. For bedbug treatment specifically, you want to focus on the seams and folds of your mattress, the bed frame joints, behind headboards, and along the edges of box springs, since these are the exact hiding spots bedbugs retreat to during daylight hours. Behind electrical outlet covers and switch plates, around the base of toilets, under sinks where pipes enter the wall. And along the perimeter of basements or crawl spaces are all other high-value target zones depending on what specific pest problem you are dealing with. The underlying principle is always the same. Find the pathways pests are actually using to move through your home and create a thin, invisible barrier along those exact pathways rather than treating your entire floor like a battlefield. Timing and patience also matter quite a bit here, because diatomaceous earth is not an instant kill the way a direct chemical spray can sometimes appear to be. Since it works through gradual dehydration rather than immediate poisoning, it can take anywhere from a few hours to a few days for an exposed insect to actually die, and for a full infestation. You are realistically looking at a treatment cycle of 1 to 3 weeks before you see the kind of dramatic reduction in pest activity people are hoping for. This is honestly another reason people sometimes give up on diatomaceous earth prematurely, expecting bodies on the floor within minutes the way a chemical spray sometimes produces, and when that does not happen immediately. They assume the product is not working and go running back to a chemical alternative. Patience is genuinely the key variable here. Reapply the dusting every week or 2, especially after vacuuming, since vacuuming will pick up both dead insects and a good portion of the applied powder along with them. Speaking of vacuuming, This is an important complementary step rather than something that undoes your work. After letting the diatomaceous earth sit for several days to do its job, vacuuming up the area removes dead insects, eggs, and old powder, after which you simply reapply a fresh light dusting to maintain the barrier going forward. One more practical note worth mentioning is moisture and humidity. Diatomaceous earth's effectiveness depends entirely on the particles staying dry, because if the powder gets wet, the sharp microscopic structures essentially clump together and lose their abrasive sharpness, turning into an inert, harmless paste, rather than the effective barrier you applied. This means it is not ideal for outdoor use right before rain, or in